All right, so today's going to be a high quality topic. This is going to be a high quality video, just packed with information. I'm going to try and keep it a little bit more condensed. But with that being said, let's get into it. So, as you can tell by the title, today's video is on one of my fundamental lifting philosophies that I have yet to talk about on this channel, and that's going to be progressive overload anxiety. And this is something that lifters either are stuck in, which most people are. You are about to get into it, which a lot of people are about to get into it. And some people, very few, have made it through this and kind of like made it to the light at the end of the tunnel and got out of this mindset. So the reason why I have this video and have this philosophy is because there's such a huge emphasis on progressive overload in fitness in general and YouTube fitness in the community without such an emphasis on what causes progressive overload and the fundamentals of hypertrophy training in the first place. Not saying there aren't videos on how to get bigger and whatever, but there seems to be way more of an emphasis on progressive overload itself rather than how to actually progressively overload and what to focus on in order to see progressive overload throughout your training. So to get into it, I want to start this off by saying, as you know, my lifting philosophy is that progressive overload is important, but you need to focus on the drivers of it rather than the result itself. If you find yourself attached to adding weight and reps every single session and you aren't getting results, it's best to reassess your training before digging yourself into a deeper hole. I have three main reasons to avoid this mentality we get stuck in, as well as a solution to overcome this mindset and get better results. So like I said, at some point or another, as a lifter, you're going to fall into this mindset. It's kind of unavoidable because you're going to hit some type of like perceived plateau, or someone's going to just keep telling you, oh, just add weight, push through that plateau. And this just isn't really how hypertrophy training works, because you have to add weight when necessary, not when possible. And I did talk about that in one of my more recent videos. I can't remember which one it was exactly. But what is progressive overload anxiety? So progressive overload anxiety, in my opinion, is when you are overly stressed about adding weight or adding reps, and you start to be so caught up in it and so worried about it that you actually sacrifice other areas of your training. And I have talked about that before, but this is when you value adding weight or adding reps more than an actual fundamental of your training in the first place. And this is extremely short-sighted. And I'm not saying progression in the long term doesn't matter, because it does. It's progression in the short term that needs to be a little bit more in check, that a lot of us get caught up in. So we get so much of an emphasis on here about adding weight every set, train harder than last time, add 5 pounds, 5 by 5. I could go on forever about all these methods and mindsets of just constantly linear progression until you're Mr. Olympia. But that's not sustainable. It's a very short-term solution, and it does not last for long. We need to be focusing more on the fundamentals and the techniques and the volume and the frequency of our training rather than just adding weight, because then you lose sight of what drives the ability to overload in your training in the first place. So that's what progressive overload anxiety is. That's when you have anxiety and you feel stressed that you didn't see visible results in your strength or in your performance in the gym. It's when you get stressed that you're doing the same weight twice in a row or 3 or even 4 weeks in a row. And we all kind of feel that because we're just in our nature, we are designed to always progress and always do better. But lifting is such a slow and long-term process that you have to be able to see what this anxiety is so you can identify and overcome it in your training. So the three problems that I have with progressive overload anxiety, and some people, like surface level, if you don't really understand this and if you haven't experienced it, it's almost like, okay, well, I would want to be worried about progressing and getting better. Like, it just makes logical sense. But in theory, that sounds awesome. In practice, it just doesn't work that well. So to get into the first problem that you will face when having this progressive overload anxiety taking over your program, it's going to be the avoidance of tracking hypertrophy lifts. And this is a huge one. This one you see all the time. How many times do you see a lifter track and put so much thought into their squat, bench, deadlift, even pull-ups, rows, or overhead press, but generally the big three and some variations of that. And then they're like, oh, well, I'll just do what feels right for bicep curls, or I just do 50 pounds every time on my skull crushers or push downs or whatever. Like, this isn't good, because what this actually is instead of you saying, oh, I just like the mind muscle connection or the pump on my isolations, that's you tricking yourself into thinking that's the best way to train them. That is not the best way to train those movements. The best way to train those movements is to train them the same way that you would in any other lift that you slowly progress on with consistent form and technique. These lifts are extremely important for hypertrophy, and too many people avoid tracking them because they don't get any immediate reward, and they don't get that instant gratification, since progression is generally slower on these lifts. So what you'll see a lot of the time is people start to kind of avoid tracking their hypertrophy work, and that's because you don't get an instant reward. Like, it takes a long time, and it's just like, it's a grind on these lifts of doing kind of the same weight and same reps for a long time before you can actually add weight, especially the further you get into your training. So what people will do is, and count how many times you've heard this before, oh, I track my compound lifts, but my isolations or hypertrophy lifts, I kind of just do what feels right. I'll like make a connection to that muscle and just do the weight that feels best on that day. But you're setting yourself up for failure here, because on the surface level, this seems like, okay, well, he's progressively overloading in his compound lifts. The hypertrophy work, he's just kind of doing the mind muscle connection and the whole pump thing. So that's totally fine as long as you're progressing on something. But what this actually is a cover up for laziness when it comes to tracking your isolation and hypertrophy lifts. Just because the progression's slower doesn't mean you don't track it. So there's no point in avoiding tracking these lifts. You should be tracking everything. And we're not just tracking it so we can write down that we added 5 pounds or added 5 reps to it or whatever. That's nice if you care about it, but the reason why we track is so we can actually measure results and make sure you're making progress over the long term. So if I'm stuck on 75 pounds for a barbell curl and I don't track it, what happens if I'm stuck on 75 for 2 years? Clearly something's not working, and I need to change up something with my training to actually keep progressing on it. So if I was just somebody that was like, oh, I'll feel like doing 65 today, I feel like 75 is heavy, or I feel like doing 80 pounds today, and I'm kind of just dilly-dallying stuck in the same weight forever, that's kind of a waste of time. And it's not that you won't get anything out of it, but if your goal is to build muscle and slowly increase your tonnage, then this is pretty crucial. So instead of saying, oh, I'm just going to do what feels right and track my compounds and progressively overload on my compounds and just hypertrophy work, just do what feels right that day, you're missing the point. This is the bulk of your training. This is what builds the muscle. It's the compound movements are nice, and getting stronger on those is nice and everything, but that's a smaller percentage of your training than your big workload and the volume of these hypertrophy movements. Like, you can't tell me that, let's say you're doing a push day, like a classic bro push-pull legs type split. You can't tell me that adding 5 pounds to your 5x5 one week is getting you all your chest gains, but then your weighted dips, your dumbbell flies, and your overhead press, lateral raises, face pulls, skull crushers, and you can't tell me like the last 7 lifts there just aren't important and you don't track them. It doesn't really make a whole ton of sense when you think about it. So avoid this mentality. Track everything. You're not tracking it to get that gratification of adding weight. You're getting it so you can actually measure your results over the long term. And keep in mind, it's not going to be every week. It depends where you're at in your lifting, but sometimes you might have to add weight every 2 weeks, every month, every 2 months, every 3 months. It really depends where you're at. And on these lifts where the skill cap is kind of low and they're a smaller lift, as in you don't use a whole ton of weight on them, it's going to take a little bit longer. So don't worry so much about that instant gratification of adding 5 pounds or adding a rep or whatever. Obviously it's important, but focus on executing that lift as well as you can, and then the results will come. It just depends how long it takes you, and you have to be able to assess your program to know when to actually make adjustments or when to realize, okay, it might take me more than just 1 week to actually progress in a visual way on this lift. So that kind of leads me into my second point here, which is going to be biasing the big three lifts. So I know I talked about this a little bit in my last point, but when you avoid tracking 90% of your lifts, as in your hypertrophy work, it leads to more of a bias, obviously, in the lifts that kind of outlast the other ones. So when I say outlast, I'm referring to the visual, tangible progression of adding weight to a lift. So you take something like a deadlift and you take something like a lat pull down. So the deadlift, the skill cap is way higher than it is on a lat pull down, and so is your ability to load the movement. Let's say you're doing 500 pounds on a deadlift for sets of 5, your lat pull down for 5 is probably like 200 pounds. So adding 5 pounds on the deadlift is a smaller increment than it is on actually adding 5 pounds on the lat pull down. That's where the difference really comes into play here. So what tends to happen is we bias the lifts with the most loading capacity. So if you start a new program with all new lifts, isolations, hypertrophy work, compound lifts, everything, the compound lifts are the ones that are going to last the longest when it comes to adding 5 pounds every week if you're doing a linear progression type model. So it's easy to say, oh, well, on week 4, I got stuck on 170 pounds on lat pull down, so I'm just going to stop tracking it. But I'm still progressing on deadlift, so I'll keep tracking that. You can see, okay, so you're starting to bias the heavier lift, and you're going to keep milking out the gains on that, while your other lifts are kind of they're getting put on the back burner, like the lat pull down, and you're missing kind of the whole point of the training at that point, because you're so caught up in that instant gratification, that instant reward that you get from seeing that you added weight to your deadlift. And there's nothing wrong with chasing progression. It's actually a useful tool if utilized properly, but you have to make sure you're doing that in everything and understand that it's not going to be instant. It's not going to be linear. If we feel the need to add weight or reps every session, we are going to put all of our focus into the lifts we can add weight the longest on. You'll quickly realize it's hard to add 5 pounds to every hypertrophy lift every week. So the last lifts standing are going to be the big, heavy compounds. We'll put so much energy into milking those out that we face attrition in our hypertrophy lifts, which are the meat and potatoes of hypertrophy training. So when I say attrition, I'm not talking about actually just getting rid of those lifts, but you're going to end up half-assing them. And I've kind of talked about that before on this channel, but generally what's going to happen is you will bias the lifts that you can keep milking out the tangible 5-pound gains on every week. And in turn, you're going to half-ass your other lifts. And maybe you don't get rid of them entirely, but you might as well if you're just going through the motions on them. The last point I have here, and you'll notice all 3 of these points kind of tie into each other, is going to be sacrificing fundamentals. So when you feel the need to add weight, even when you're stuck in a plateau, you will sacrifice a fundamental, which is typically going to be technique, rep speed, or range of motion. I recommend checking out my real versus artificial progressive overload video, as well as my progression and plateaus video for my best thoughts on this. So as you know, you have to make real progress. And what happens when we start to worry so much about progressive overload and just adding weight every single time or adding reps every single time is it's extremely short-sighted, and you're going to start to sacrifice other aspects of your training in order to hit that 5-pound increase on whatever lift you're executing at that day. So what happens here? You drive yourself into a hole. You get off track and you keep digging yourself deeper and deeper into a hole by doing this. So let's say you are stuck on a barbell curl and you have good technique, consistent technique, but then one day you just stop adding weight. What happens is, if you're addicted to adding 5 pounds and you have this stress and constant anxiety and that you feel the need to constantly add weight to that lift, you're inevitably going to sacrifice another area. You're going to sacrifice your form, your range of motion, your technique. Those are the typical 3 that I talked about. There's a bunch of other ways you can do this too, but the problem with that is it's super short-sighted, because now yeah, I mean, it's not the end of the world to cheat on your form a little bit, but as long as it's consistent. Like, you don't have to have perfect form and technique on everything, but it does have to be consistent. If I have strict form on a 50-pound barbell curl and I get stuck at 50 pounds and then I use a little bit less of a strict form and go up to 60 pounds, I didn't actually add 10 pounds. That's short-sighted. I'm just stealing 10 pounds from my range of motion or my technique or whatever. And that's a problem because now I'm kind of messing up with my training. I'm interfering with my long-term progression. So you can see how that's short-sighted. So last week I did 50 pounds for 10. This week I have to do better because I'm so stressed. If I don't overload, I'm not building muscle. And that's just not how it works. You have to take a step back. You have to zoom out a little bit and say, okay, maybe I can just do 50 pounds for another week. It might take me 2 weeks, it might take me a month, 2 months, it might take me 3 months. And that's fine. But you have to be able to assess when you need to actually say, you know what, I'm stuck and I should probably rotate my lifts or change something up in my training to keep going. Like if I'm stuck on 50 pounds for 2 years, probably I should change something up. But if it's 2 weeks or a month or even 2 months, you have to zoom out, guys. You have to think a little bit longer term with this stuff. So here's my solution. Take a deep breath, zoom out, and look at the big picture. So as I was just saying, you have to be able to think long term. So if you're constantly caught up in adding 5 pounds or adding reps every single time, you are going to start to sacrifice other areas of your training. So you have to be able to establish when this is happening, and you have to see it and you have to be able to understand what it is, and then you have to overcome it. So when I feel the need to like hit a new PR on every lift, every workout, I have to understand some lifts are gonna maybe regress slightly because day-to-day progression doesn't really mean a whole ton in the short term. And we have to basically make sure that we're doing the best that we can consistently. And over time, you will start to notice some gains. You won't see it in the day-to-day. So what you want to do here is get better at the same weight by overloading and improving technique and disregard strength for the time being. And I'll explain this in a second. You can get great gains with the same weight. Once technique is better, then the strength will come naturally. I also recommend checking out my technique resetting video for my full thoughts on this. So to leave you guys with a solution, you have to be able to understand when you feel this anxiety and feel the stress of having to progressively overload because it's been drilled into our heads. And there's a huge imbalance in the lifting community of progressive overload versus the actual causes of progressive overload and what establishes it in the first place. So your training fundamentals and your technique and everything. So not that there's something wrong with chasing progression and wanting progression, because at the end of the day, it's a really good tool as long as it's utilized properly. But we're always told to progressively overload, but nobody talks quite as much about why or what causes it or what you need to do to actually achieve progressive overload in the first place. So I do think that leads a lot of people down this path of having progressive overload anxiety. So what you need to do is you have to first be able to understand when it's happening and when you should actually say, okay, let's stick at this same weight and let's get better at what I have in front of me before I move on. So think long term. One solution that I have, first you have to be able to recognize when this is appropriate to apply, because if you're actually linearly progressing on something with good technique, probably don't stop that. But if you feel like you're sacrificing other areas and you're not getting results and you're sacrificing technique or range of motion just to add 5 pounds on a lift, here's the way to overcome that. Forget about the weight. Forget about the reps. Practice that lift and keep getting better at it. Stick with the same weight, and the way that you're going to overload this one, this is actually still progressive overload, is by just getting better at your actual technique. Like, keep the same weight, keep the same reps, or don't even worry so much about reps, but just get better at that lift. Keep going on it. Like, let's take a barbell curl, for example. Get as good as you can. Pretend that the weight you're stuck on, let's say it's 75 pounds, is the only weight that you have in that gym. You have to use 75 pounds for the rest of your life. what are you going to do? You're going to have to get better at it. You're going to have to keep going, improve your technique, make it tough, get more out of less weight. Once that's all basically perfected, that will actually cause progressive overload, and the strength just comes with it naturally. So take a weight, get as good as you can on it. If you're stuck on a 200-pound bench for 10 reps, and you stick with that for 3 months, and you get better at the 200-pound bench for 10 reps, that's still progressive overload, even though the weight, the reps, and the sets are still all the same. So don't worry so much about this constant linear progression. Focus a little bit more on taking a step back, get really good at what you have in front of you, and the strength will come naturally. The overload will come naturally. Analyze your fundamentals, analyze your program before you start to try and artificially progress. So without dragging this video on too much longer, I am going to leave it at that today. So thanks for watching if you watched to the end. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions.